Hello, class. We are back to talk about the president. More specifically, the presidency, not just the current occupant, not just Trump, but the presidency in general, and what that is under is the executive branch. So, last lecture we covered the legislative branch, which is Congress, right? Today we're doing the executive branch, which is the presidency. So, want to get you started really simply here. Most of you all know this, but if you didn't, the qualifications to be president. What does the Constitution say about that? Does anyone know how old you have to be? That's right, 35 years old. You have to be 35. You have to be born in the United States, and you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years consecutively. 14 years of consecutive residency in the US. If you're born here, you move away and come back. It has to be that 14 years. So those are the three stipulations, the three things you have to meet those standards in order to qualify to run for president or to be president under the Constitution. Now, I have a question for you. And I want you to listen very carefully because it's kind of a trick question, okay? So in 2008, President Obama ran against Senator McCain. So Obama McCain, right? One of these candidates, one of these people was, without any factual dispute, born outside of the United States of America. Before you answered, which person, Barack Obama or John McCain, in the 2008 election, they were the two major party candidates. Which one of those candidates was born outside of the U.S.? And the answer is John McCain. See, I told you it was a trick question. Just the reason it's a trick question is because, and I don't want to be controversial, but it's just a fact. So the reason that's a trick question is because John McCain was born in a U.S. military, and this is before I get to the big controversy. It was born in a U.S. military base. So if you're born in a U.S. military base in Panama, like John McCain was, that still counts as the U.S. Okay, so if you were born in Germany, South Korea, places like that where we have lots of troops, and that's your mom and dad, you're born there, you can run for president. You're an American citizen. So that's the reason. Now, the reason that was a trick question was not only because you may not have known you can be born outside the U.S. but in a military or U.S. embassy, etc., and still that would still count as being born in the United States. But the other thing was this controversy about, and it's called the birther theory or the conspiracy, whatever words you want to use. But if you've never heard of that, it's not a term you would hear in normal day language of birther. But it was started by Donald Trump before he was president, and it was a conspiracy theory that, I mean, I don't know how else to categorize it because it isn't true. The theory was that President Obama wasn't born in the U.S. So Trump, when he was a private citizen, was promoting this theory on Fox News and other outlets, Twitter, etc. Trump more or less said, I'm not going to be able to quote him verbatim, but Trump more or less said that, if Obama is born outside of the U.S., as Trump thought he was, that it would be the biggest, con job in the history of, the United States. It would be the biggest. That's what I think. Con job was the word, the phrase he used. So President Obama, and I mean, I'm going to try to stay balanced in this and controversy, but there were people who were saying hey, you know what? That's kind of racist. To say that the first African American candidate for major office, the presidency, to accuse that person of being born out of the country kind of comes across as like, why not the other 43 presidents? Why this one? And so I try not to give my opinion, but I will say to me, it came across as racist. Regardless, I can't read someone's heart, but I will say this much. The theory was untrue. Okay. The theory was untrue. Obama was born in the US. He was born in Hawaii. Okay. So, anyway, I don't know if you knew that background of Trump and Obama, but that was like a big conspiracy that he promoted. And so Obama did something that no other president that I know of has ever done, based on somebody, saying you're not from this country. He actually, in the middle of his presidency, a couple years in, released his long form birth certificate to just be like, here, let's put it to rest, please. I thought it was sad that he had to do that, if that makes sense. Were the other 43 presidents asked to do that were not African American? It I hope that wasn't the motivation, but to be honest, most people, and you could probably tell, including me, saw that the birther theory had racist origin. At least to the extent that why wasn't this ever an issue with any other president, right? So sorry if I delved too deeply into my opinion, but I was just trying to give you a background on the president has to be born in the country, right? And Obama was, and that was why, now going back to that trick question, McCain, now that if you didn't know that whole birther conspiracy, now you know why it's such a trick question. And if your political friends know, you could ask them, hey, which one of these candidates was born outside of the U.S.? Was it John McCain or was it Obama? And if they're fully informed, they would say, hey, it was John McCain. He was born in Panama, and military base is the same thing as being born in the U.S. So that was a trick question. Okay, forgive my wading into controversy a little bit, but you need to understand the context. Okay, so that's how you qualify to be president. You are born in the U.S. You're 35 or more years old. You live 14 years residency, so that gives you the flexibility to leave, go see the world, see how other governments work maybe, and come back and have some more wisdom. 35 also seems like really young. I'm saying that because I'm in my 30s, maybe. No, but think about it, right? I mean, Donald Trump is 74 years old. He's 74. Joe Biden is 77. There's essentially a 99.9% chance that one of those two people will be president next. So that means that, 35 isn't that old nowadays, is it? I mean, if you're looking at a candidate, Joe Biden will be 78 if he wins and he's sworn in. Trump would still be 74 because he just had his birthday. So 35. So I just bring this up because 35. Think about what has changed since the Constitution was written in terms of life expectancy. Everything, right? It's doubled and a half. So or at least doubled, right? So life expectancy is, forget my math if it's not exactly doubled. It's massively increased. We'd have to look up the numbers. I don't want to get lost in that. So just understand that 35 back then was not 35 today because people just didn't live as long, right? Okay, and someone can, if you want extra credit, look up the actual statistics of life expectancy, in the late 1700s and life expectancy today in the United States. Be curious. Okay, let's get into what does the president actually have the power to do. We're really going to focus on five things, okay? So five big powers the president has. Number one, we'll get right into it now. Number one, the president can veto. And if you were watching the last lecture, you remember what a veto is. A veto is when Congress brings something like a bill, which legislation is just a fancy way of saying a bill, right? So they make legislation, they write a bill, and if that bill gets the president's signature, it becomes law. So here's how powerful a presidential veto is. A presidential veto is 99% effective if you look at historically. And it's because, remember, because 2/3 of Congress can override the president if he vetoes something. If he says, no, I don't want this bill that you're giving me to become law, I veto it. It's not law. 2/3 of Congress can override that, but it's super rare and it's about less than 1% of the time. So, with that said, now that you're learning this presidential veto power, you can write in your notes that the presidential veto is at least 99% effective. In other words, it's not going to be overridden very often. And so, wait a minute. What if the president, while the Congress is writing legislation, they're writing a bill, and they're like, we want to address, police brutality, say. If the president says, whoever the president is, if the president says, I know you all are drafting this in Congress, this bill, this legislation, but if you put this in it, X, Y, or Z, I promise you I'll veto it. Do presidents do that? Yes. They threaten a veto. It's not like a violent threat, right? It's I'm gonna, unless you're the paper that gets thrown in the trash, essentially, right? The veto threat is to say, if you make this bill and you get it all the way to my desk, I'm not going to sign it. I'm going to veto it. So take that part out and then bring it to me. And so Congress will, unless they have that 2/3 and they know it, they're not. So in other words, an average vote maybe would be 52-48, 53-47 in the Senate out of 100 people, right? You'd have to get from, let's say it's a really, really popular thing, 60 votes out of 100. That's really high. 67 is what you would need to override the president. And that's just a really high mark. So number one on your list here, what are the presidential powers? Presidential power to veto, and it's a strong power because even the threat of it makes Congress go think, okay, I have to rework this legislation because the president's going to veto it unless we get this part out or get this part in. So maybe the president wants something included in it, right? Okay, so does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. All right, let's keep rolling. Number two on our list here, presidents can do something that it just happened actually today. If you're watching this video, June 16th, President Trump signed, and here's what number two is for our list, executive order, an executive order. So here's what an executive order is. So President Trump's was, I don't have the full executive order in front of me, but it was essentially about police brutality and creating incentives. Here are a couple things I know. Creating incentives for police to use other services like, say, a social service worker to deal with someone who has mental illness that the police are needing to talk to or perhaps even arrest or whatever the case is, right? Does that make sense so far? So executive order, this is what President Trump did today. The other thing is that President Trump said in his executive order, more or less, was that chokeholds are now banned. So unless the officer's life is threatened. And then there will perhaps, as far as I know, but I want to say perhaps because I'm not 100% sure, be a registry of police officers who, if they get fired for a violent reason or infraction, they're now in the registry and they can't just, move and go to another police department and no one knows what their record is, so they get hired again and then they hurt someone else. Does that make sense? So that was what was in the executive order today. I'm going to be honest with you. There are very, very, very liberal people and very, very conservative people that agree on this. And it's a really good thing. It's a really good thing. What? That we're at least having the conversation as a country, lawmakers, finally having a conversation about police brutality, especially against people of color, right? So democracy is working. How do we know? Because people are on the streets and now people are in Washington, D.C. listening. They have to listen because why? Because we vote them in or out, right? Or out. It's up to you. I'm not even going to touch your vote. It is your vote. But let's get back to executive orders. So there's all kinds of executive orders. I'm going to give you one of, in my opinion, the best in history, one of the best, and one of the worst. Okay. So one of the best was, you could argue the Emancipation Proclamation is the greatest executive order ever, right? Because the president by himself, Abraham Lincoln, just made the declaration that there is no such thing as slavery anymore. You cannot own a person. That's just unbelievable it took that long. But it happens, and here it is in this executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation, finally saying slavery is gone. Now, where it gets bad is if you fast forward about 80, almost 100 years, but about 80 years, you have President FDR. And you could argue that every president has certain executive orders that are unpopular or maybe undemocratic, but this one was unacceptable. And I am taking a side on this one, yes. And you'll see why. And so does the United States government now. Because what FDR did was he had an executive order that he signed, which is a presidential. So here's a definition just quickly, because I'm going to get back to the definition stuff, but I just wanted to give you some examples first. It's a proclamation of law by the president. So we can write that for now. Proclamation of law by the president. They just could have proclaimed something. Now I'm going to tell you in a minute and show you all the ways where that can be stopped by the other branches. But FDR writes an executive order. He proclaims it as law, and he says, "We're rounding up." He says the United States is rounding up Japanese Americans, and it was the singular most racist executive order. It said, if you are of this if you're this ancestry, ethnicity, you're going to go to an internment camp. Now, it wasn't a concentration camp. The United States didn't go that far, thank God. But you have people, think about this. Think about how racist this is. You have people rounded up and put in a big jail together because of their race. That's the only reason they're going to jail. The only reason they're going to this internment camp. Call it what you will. But there's one in many in California, sadly. So FDR proclaims this. Why did he do it, first of all? Well, his defense is going to be because of Pearl Harbor, and the United States got attacked by Japan during that incident in Hawaii, and it was a huge deal. I mean, the U.S. got attacked. Other than 9/11, that's like the second biggest attack on the U.S. soil, um, outside of 9/11. So it was a big deal, but FDR's response was then taken to the Supreme Court. Okay, so let me explain now the ways, because this example opens us up perfectly. The ways in which an executive order can be shot down. In other words, the president proclaims something. FDR says, round up people of Japanese ancestry. How could it have been stopped? Here's the ways that it could have been stopped. Number one, the next president could overturn it, could write an executive order banning that or erasing it. We're going to get to number two really quick because we don't want number one right now. Why? Because we don't have time to wait for the next president. People are getting rounded up based on their race right now in this story, right? In this real life story. So we have to take that into consideration, right? So the Supreme Court, so we can't wait for the next president. It has to happen now. But that is one option, that the president could be overruled by the next president. And if the president, say today, writes an executive order, whoever's president next could scratch it out, essentially, right? So the second way is the Supreme Court. Supreme Court could say, you know what, this is unconstitutional. You can't round up people by race. That would have been awesome if they did that. Sadly, there's a case called Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu was a person, American citizen. Think about this. American citizen who's stripped of his constitutional rights for only one reason, because of his race, his ethnicity. That's it. He sues. And this is one great thing about the United States. You can sue the government. The only bad thing, you don't always win. In this case, embarrassingly to our country, to the United States, embarrassingly, the Supreme Court ruled against Korematsu and essentially said that during wartime, the president has extraordinary power, and they were going to defer to that power. They were basically saying, we're not going to question what you're doing to keep the country safe, is what the majority decision was of the Supreme Court. And that's devastating to think about, isn't it? Because, in other words, the president wrote a proclamation. Okay, we're mad at the president for doing that now. As we look back and we see that that's, I mean, I'm sure there were people that were mad at the time, but we're taking the class now, right? But the Supreme Court could have stopped it. They didn't. Now there's one other, so the next president can stop it. Supreme Court can stop it and call it unconstitutional because someone will inevitably sue. And there's a third way that an executive order, the presidential proclamation, can be shot down or null and void. And that is if it requires money from Congress. And if Congress doesn't give the money. Now, does rounding people up and based on their race and putting them in camps, like what happened in this story with FDR, true life story, to Japanese Americans, in doing that, you are sacrificing their constitutional freedoms. As an American citizen, you have the right, remember we said last class, the right to due process and the right to a trial by jury, and you're not allowed to be searched or seized unless there's a crime that you've been said to have committed or about to commit. So forgive me for getting off track a little bit, but Congress, coming back, Congress, did they have to give money to this? Yes, it cost money. So there's the third way that this executive order, which is heinous by FDR, could have been shot down, was Congress could have just said, you know what, no, we're not going to give any money to this. This is unacceptable. And even though the Supreme Court didn't rule that, we're ruling that. Nope. It was paid for. So, what is the lesson? Executive orders like Abraham Lincoln, amazing. Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most hopeful things in American history. FDR's one of the most hurtful. I think that's fair to say. There've been a lot of executive orders, but I'm just trying to give you some big examples. Okay, I'm going to give you one more, and this one is not as I mean, it's actually extremely controversial still, but in a different way. So it's actually quite similar. So not as I think aloud here. So in 2008, President Obama got elected, right? And not only did he get elected, but Democrats in the House and Senate were the majority now. So that means if they wanted to vote something in, they had more votes than the Republicans, right? And Obama got elected in large part due to his platform of peace. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in part for his executive order to close down Guantanamo Bay and his promise to do so all along. So he signs an executive order, President Obama does. If you don't know what Guantanamo Bay is, this is where I say the similarity between Korematsu. It's an eerie similarity. It's not one I like to see, but it's important that we notice a similarity. After 9/11 happens, the United States, which is a really kind of a weird scenario, but this is true. The United States rents a space in Cuba that we now call Guantanamo Bay or Gitmo. And it's a U.S. military base. Why is it in Cuba? Instead of thinking that, think this. Why isn't it in the U.S.? That's the only thing that we care, because it could be anywhere on Earth. It's weird that it's in Cuba because remember last lecture, we don't get along with them and I couldn't bring Cuban cigars back from Jamaica and everything. But why is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba? And the answer is it could be anywhere outside the United States, Cuba, anywhere. Why is it outside the U.S.? And the answer is because then you don't have to give people constitutional rights, or at least that's what the government claimed after 9/11, right? So we'll just, instead of doing a Korematsu in the U.S., we'll just do it outside the U.S. and then there can't be a complaint. But then there is a Korematsu. Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. I'm not going to hold you to these Supreme Court cases because you're taking an introductory class in government. So, but great to know. Hamdan versus Rumsfeld is one of the cases that the Supreme Court basically said Guantanamo Bay is not constitutional. So stay with me. This had already happened before Obama actually got in office. The Supreme Court had already ruled Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. They already said it was unconstitutional, okay? Obama comes in and tries to cement that and say, like, well, people are still there, so here, I'm making an executive order. It is officially closed. I am proclaiming it as president. And guess what? It's still open right now. Still open. President Obama was inaugurated in 2009, early 2009, and now we are in mid 2020. Still open. Why? Because the third reason on our list here, Congress. Now I'm going to be hard on Congress, okay? If you are President Obama and you come in as a Democrat, and it could have been a Republican, it doesn't matter. For this story, the point is, his popularity at the time catapulted a lot of other Democrats into office. Okay, so in other words, they won the House and Senate not just because people were sick of Republicans in charge. It was also the energy that Obama brought to the ballot, if that makes sense. Okay, so the Democrats had every reason to do what Obama wanted, his platform, what he had promised, because they had been swept into office with him, if that makes sense. Not everyone. There were Democrats that were already there, but their popularity was boosted by him. So he was, I think, one of the most popular presidents going in that you're going to see in your lifetime. President Trump has just to give a comparison, has a ceiling at about 46% popularity that hasn't been able to breach. So, long story short, Democrats ascend into Congress. They're, in other words, they have control of the money. We learned that last lecture, right? So they could easily just provide the money to the president that he's made this executive order now. Provide the money to him to execute the executive order. In other words, to make it happen. To shut down the facility means you're going to have to take the people that are there and put them in the United States and then figure out if they're terrorists. So that, by the way, if you wasn't clear, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and why we're there and why people are against it, we were putting people there who are accused of, just like Korematsu, there's this guilty by association of. Now look, there were, in the case of Guantanamo Bay, some, I don't know how many, and I don't know if the US government's disclosed it, but there were at least one or two, and maybe more, actual like terrorists in Guantanamo Bay. Okay. But then there was hundreds of alleged terrorists. And you might say, well, dude, if you're an alleged terrorist, I mean, I'm happy to have you over in Cuba. I don't want you here. That's why President Obama wrote the executive order. The Supreme Court also codified that essentially, and Congress still didn't do it. Why? Because I'm just going to be blunt with it. If you're, say, a congressman in Florida or congresswoman in Florida, and someone says, okay, it's time to make true on Obama's promise, we're going to send these terrorists and alleged terrorists to Florida, to Miami, and put them in prison there. If you're the congresswoman from Miami or the congressman from Miami, how do you feel explaining to your constituents who aren't taking this class? How do you explain to them that you're bringing terrorists and alleged terrorists, but all they're going to hear is terrorists coming into our city, in our jails, watching TV, using our legal system, getting food and health care? No way. And so now you know why. Obama orders it. Nothing happened. Wins a Nobel Peace Prize over it. I mean, over the issue of closing Guantanamo Bay and nuclear non-proliferation. Say that 5 times fast. Nuclear non-proliferation, which basically means not spreading nuclear weapons around the world. And just to be clear, I don't take sides on any president, but it's an important history that president can order something and nothing happens. Nothing. And that's exactly what happened with Obama's order. And it's out of his control. Now that makes sense why, right? Okay, so executive order. Now let's move on to our next point. What else do presidents have the power to do? Executive privilege. Executive privilege. And anytime you hear this one, you should be skeptical. Why? What should you be skeptical of? So here's what it is. Executive privilege is when the president gets to withhold secrets from the American people, for sure, and even potentially from Congress and his own cabinet, potentially. It depends. It depends on what? It all depends on one thing. Is the secret that you're keeping based on national security interests? In other words, if I tell someone this secret, American people will die or potentially die. That's the only type of secret the president can keep. So let me give you an example. President Obama in 2000s authorizes the raid on Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. And did he convene 435 members of the House at 2 a.m. or whatever time it was, 100 members of the Senate, and ask them to vote on it? No. They have that 90-day window we talked about, the War Powers Act from last lecture about Congress, right? So they have that 90 days. President Obama didn't tell anyone. He used executive privilege by keeping it the operation a secret, and that is perfectly, like, we would all want, even if you're not an Obama fan, like, nobody wants the president to spoil, capturing the worst terrorist on earth, by having to tell people, right? And we knew immediately after, and that's fine. Does that make sense? So that's spot on in terms of when you should use one. right? Um, you're keeping a secret for the right reason. It's to keep people safe and to keep the mission safe and to get what you need on behalf of the United States, security wise. It's all about that, right? But then I know Nixon's going to come up a lot. I feel so bad for him, but he did it to himself, right? So with Nixon, it's interesting because you all know that he basically resigned because he wasn't going to get impeached. But what you may not have known is that he recorded himself doing incriminating things, like, for example, paying people off in the millions of dollars for breaking into the Watergate Hotel and trying to bug, which, nowadays is probably really much easier. You don't have to physically go in there to try to bug the phone so he could hear about the Democrats, strategies and all this. And the funny thing is, Nixon won that election by so much. He blew out the Democrats in that election. But then, as the investigation wore on, and as he did to keep the people quiet who had broken in and gotten caught, he said through all this, executive privilege. This is national security secrets. I can't tell you. I can't. So he recorded himself and saying these incriminating things that he was doing and having other people do on behalf of himself, not the country, not the national security interest, not even close. That's a joke, right? So guess what happened? Congress said, we heard that you have tapes. Mr. Butterfield is the one who told us. Go look that up. I'm not joking. We found out there's tapes. You recorded yourself, incriminating yourself. Congress said, give us the tapes. And Congress has the right to subpoena. Subpoena, you can actually add this if you want to your list from last. Subpoena power basically means the right to demand someone give documents to you. The reason I didn't list it on our last list of congressional powers is because one simple reason. There is no way to enforce it. There's a judge can issue a subpoena and it's enforceable by a police officer's gun, but not so with Congress. So Congress subpoenas Nixon's tapes and says, come on, the American people deserve to hear this. If you're innocent, then even more reason to let us listen, because then it will just prove your innocence. He says, no, it's national security. And what are we learning in this? Executive privilege, he says. I can keep this secret. Thank goodness the Supreme Court, and this was a good Supreme Court decision here. Unanimously, every single person in the Supreme Court says, you know what? You have to give the tapes. And finally, as that ruling came down, I always kind of think to myself, as a Supreme Court ruling was announced, like, okay, Nixon has to give the tapes. Like 30 seconds later, Nixon's just like, okay, let's give the speech. I'm going to go spend more time with my family. I need to play some more golf. And he's done. He's going to resign. Why would he go through the impeachment and the embarrassment? He's done. And he knew that. So that's what happened. Executive privilege there didn't save him. Why? Because it didn't apply. It didn't apply. Okay, so we've got executive order, executive privilege. Next, we're going to say this, and this came up last class as well, signing treaties. Okay, so the president has the ability, President Trump, whoever's president, has the ability to sign treaties. Here's the catch. Remember, the treaties have to be ratified by the United States Senate. That basically means they have to vote on it, and if the vote passes, then it's cemented into law. So why do we put this as a presidential power? Here's why. Because President Obama got us into, remember we talked about the Iran Treaty and the Paris Climate Accord for several years. So if you're a president, you might do it for this reason. You're like, well, Senate's not going to come along. If I don't have Congress, at least until the next president comes, we'll be in this treaty. So it gives them that temporary latitude, if that makes sense, right? And then you've got the idea, last but not least here. I rarely check my notes. But sometimes, two more things. I try to go right off the top of my head, but I'm only human. Okay, so appointment power, and I think we've discussed this, where the president gets to put people in positions. This, if you didn't catch from the last lecture, is a power that the Senate has to say yes to as well. So the president can sign treaties. That was our last one. And now we're talking about the president being able to make nominations, which become appointments. In other words, if I say, I'm going to nominate so and so for this position, and the Senate says yes, then you've been appointed. You're there. Who are those people again? Remember, if you didn't catch it from last lecture, I'll give you a list that is of temporary people that can be replaced at any time by the president. And then hopefully for the president, ratified, and essentially is, you could use that word, confirmed, and then they're in. Secretary of Defense, member Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of the State, which is the chief diplomat of the United States. All these different appointments or nominations the president gets to make, they're then cemented if the Senate says yes, okay, they're in, and now only the president can fire them. So if you want to add this to your list, right after appointment power is firing power. Now put a a note there saying that with the appointment power, the Senate has to say yes. With the firing power, the president can just fire the head of the FBI, the head of Homeland Security, the head of Department of Defense, Department of Education. They can just fire anyone at any time and give the absolute most minimal legal reason. And I've seen some recently, and it's just this person has lost the faith of the president. The president doesn't have faith in this person being able to execute their job anymore. That's just the president just got sick of you, dude. I'm sorry, you're out. And that's a presidential power. It's a big presidential power, isn't it? I mean, because not only you get to put that person there, but they kind of have to do your bidding or they're out, right? I mean, depending on what type of president you are, you're not going to allow, at least this administration, just objectively, they've released a lot of people. We said, remember, high turnover, and hey, president can do that, but firing power, man, that's a really powerful thing, isn't it, for the president? Okay, so last but not least, so we've done signing treaties, appointments, etc., is pardon power. Pardon power is huge. Now, one thing you need to know about pardon power for the president, technically the president can only pardon people convicted of federal crimes. Okay, so federal crimes. So if you've done something within your state only, that's not a federal crime necessarily. But if you've crossed states, say almost any time, if you've committed fraud, because the wire transactions of literally siphoning money go across states, that would be, the FBI would get involved in that type of thing. So the president can pardon essentially any federal crime for any reason. Again, they're going to give some legal reason, but it doesn't have to be much substantively, honestly. So the president pardoning, so I'll give you one example. This one is controversial. You can go look this up if you don't know about this and you don't know why President Trump's a controversial president. I'm only going to introduce you to the controversy. I'm not going to take a side, but I'll tell you about President Trump's first pardon as president. There was a guy, or is a guy named Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And if you know, when you follow the news and immigration laws and protections for immigrants, you know who this person is. Sheriff Joe Arpaio was the sheriff in Arizona who was, how do we say? I mean, I think it's fair. He was enforcing laws that were passed down to him by Arizona. So first, I'm going to blame Arizona, and then you can clearly blame him for breaking the law in a second. You'll see. So first, the law is passed in Arizona that says essentially you can pull someone over and ask for their papers and this and that, essentially based on how they, and this is completely racist, basically saying that the police could have probable cause to pull people over and ask their immigration status, etc., based on how they looked or sounded. That's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment doesn't say you can search or seize someone if they are of a certain race and you assume that race and your race. No, no. So here's the good news. That Arizona law that he was enforcing, the Sheriff Joe was enforcing, that was profiling people based on the color of their skin and how they spoke, was overruled by the Supreme Court of the United States. So the United States Supreme Court overrules this. So a handful of years ago, overrules it. And so what does that mean? Well, when the Supreme Court overrules a state law, that means no state can do that law anymore, right? So what do you think, Sheriff Joe? So technically in Arizona, it's illegal now. What they had on the books is now off the books, right? Because it's been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Here's where Sheriff Joe and the controversy comes in. More controversy, I should say. He comes and looks at the Supreme Court case and says, read between the lines. I'm not going to flick you off. That's just the funny way of saying it, right? He says, read between the lines, buddy. I ain't doing what you say. So he continues to enforce the immigration law that had just been ruled unconstitutional. So what is he doing? He's breaking federal law now. So why does this guy come up? Because we were talking about federal pardons. So Joe Arpaio, this sheriff, at one point he was technically following Arizona's law, but then the law becomes ruled unconstitutional, which it always was. And then he's still enforcing it. Now he's a lawbreaker. So he's on his way to federal prison. He's convicted of just enforcing a law, or obeying, I guess, enforcing a law that was unconstitutional. And he's about to go, he's on his way to federal prison, and President Trump pardons him. So now you know why President Trump is controversial. Pardon power is a big, big power. I'm going to give you one more. This one's more like political gossip, just to keep it interesting for you all. There's someone named Rod Blagojevich. Rod Blagojevich, say that 5 times fast. Rod Blagojevich was governor of Illinois when a certain then U.S. Senator Obama became president. So stay with me here. This was President Trump's other pardon, was that I'm going to mention, just so keep it relevant for you all. He decided to pardon Rod Blagojevich, who had taken place in his or taken part, I should say, in his Apprentice series. I think it was like the celebrity version. Okay, so why does he pardon Rod Blagojevich? I am going to leave that question up to you. Go answer that on your own. None of my business. Why did he pardon him? But here's what Rod Blagojevich did. So he's governor of Illinois when Obama gets elected to White House. So when someone leaves the Senate and goes, in this case, to the presidency, the governor of that state gets to replace that senator, right? Because we need 100 senators. We need 2 per state. And Obama's gone now, so we need someone else from Illinois. So here's how it works. The governor puts someone in a position temporarily until you can have an actual election. Because you can't just have an election the next day. Obama got elected and then, now we don't have a senator. Tomorrow, the next election to replace him. No, the governor's got it for now. We give it, say, at least 3 months, and then we have an election. And there's time to get awareness out and get everything set up, and we have an election. So say 3 to 6 months later, we're going to have an election. And now the person who's in the Senate seat, remember Obama's left, the person who's in the Senate seat, they, by being put there, have a huge advantage over whoever is going to run against them in this short window of time. Okay? They have this person who's already in by the governor has a huge advantage, and there's one thing: their name. What do you mean? When the governor announced whoever this person, Smith, Jones, whatever. When they announced that, it was in the newspapers, it was everywhere, and this person's dropping out of sight. Governor Blagojevich appoints Jones. Boom. Actually don't know the person's name off the top of my head, so I wasn't expecting to tell this story, so we can look that up. The person's appointment, though, was temporary until the election, right? But the advantage is whoever's going to get appointed here, if this were not corrupt at all, this would be the same truth. Whoever's appointed here, because you're going to see what the governor's corruption was like, whoever's here has a massive advantage because they were put there by the governor. So now the people are like, I don't really know either candidate, probably, right? But I've heard of this one, and the governor put them in. So unless you really hate the governor, you're probably just going to vote that senator in. And most people don't vote in these elections anyway. So, there you go, right? Is that kind of making sense? I hope so. Okay, so to review, we have pardons, and Rob Blagojevich is in charge of giving this Senate seat that Obama has just vacated to someone. Here's where the corruption comes in. Rob Blagojevich says he's a Democrat, and Trump's a Republican, which is interesting in the story because you wouldn't think Trump would pardon someone from a different party, maybe, right? So Rob Blagojevich is why I really honestly don't know why I pardoned him, but here's what Rob Blagojevich did. He said, look, everyone knows this Senate seat that I'm about to appoint someone to is, in his words, effing gold. How do I know those words? Because the FBI got a warrant to wiretap him because he was that corrupt, okay? So a judge says, yeah, you can listen in on this governor because he's potentially selling the Senate seat. So here's the Senate seat, right? Rob Blagojevich says to the people coming in, and I don't know their names, but whomever, and it's not their fault that he's trying to corrupt them, right? He says, that this Senate seat that I have that you want is a golden effing egg, is what he called it on these FBI recordings. A golden egg. And he said he wouldn't give it up for nothing, right? So stay with me. Here's corruption at its core. A person that's a senator voted in rightfully, legally, by whether you like the person, but rightfully voted in, leaves by being rightfully voted to another office. The governor has a solemn duty to put someone in charge until the special election that he thinks or she thinks is a good leader and representative for the state to the U.S. Senate. And so instead of doing that, just doing it, Rob Blagojevich says, I'm selling this. I'm selling access to Senate, to the United States Senate. And thankfully, he got busted. And so he went to federal prison. And that was, for the last part of this lecture, I was going to give you some political gossip. That was the most interesting pardon I've heard of in a while, was Rob Blagojevich, after selling the Senate seat that vacated by the President of the United States, got pardoned by his former boss on a game show. That's true. Technically, Trump was his boss on Apprentice. So American politics is crazy, isn't it? It's crazy. I hope you all like it a little bit. I hope you enduring it okay. I hope I didn't go on too long, but hey, well done, everyone. Cheers until the next time. God bless. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Professor V. For now.